especial vindo diretamente de Bruxelas, Roberto Viola, para nos fazer a sua apresentação da Connectivity Package.
Dear Fatima, dear Secretary of State, dear Pilar del Castillo, dear Sebastián Soriano, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me to the Gigabit conference. And I'm really grateful to ANACOM for having selected the title this year of the conference. I would say in honor of the presentation of the connectivity package of the Commission, which is about the Gigabit Society. Before presenting to you what is the reason that really led us to present this package, let me underline what has been already said by the Minister and by Mrs. Baros about where Portugal stands. And let me, by doing so, congratulate the work that ANACOM has done during the years and the Portuguese authorities to bring Portugal in the forefront of connectivity in Europe. As a matter of fact, connectivity in Portugal is well above the European average, especially in the fixed line. As a matter of fact, 70% of Portuguese citizens can access 100 megabit connectivity, which is really impressive. And it's more impressive that there are more Portuguese citizens that can access fiber than any other citizen in Europe. And when you see the number of Portuguese citizens that have fiber, this is 10 times more of the US citizens that can access fiber. So we are always looking at the other side of the Atlantic, especially from your perspective. I mean, but to be honest, Europe, and in this case Portugal, in many areas is in the forefront of the world when it comes to delivering the digital society. Europe has based, especially when it comes to connectivity, its model on competition. That was remarked in the introductory remarks of the president of ANACOM, and this has been the right thing to do, because Europe has now a very competitive market. Everywhere in Europe, citizens can choose which operator to subscribe, can choose from mobile, fixed offers, and they have a freedom of choice and quality which is nowhere paralleled in the world. And that's really, I mean, an achievement of Europe and an achievement of European regulation, which has been applied extremely well in Portugal, where thanks to the really pro-competitive way of looking at especially access and access to physical infrastructure, thanks to this choice, which has been made some 15 years ago, Portugal developed a model which is at the forefront in terms of having a lot of investment in fiber. So it shows that when a country, when a regulator insists in a sort of virtuous path towards achieving objectives and is coherent towards this path, that can make a change. So many congratulations for the results, but as it was remarked also by the minister, a lot needs to be done also in Portugal, because if it is true that high quality networks are available for many Portuguese, it's also true that there are areas which are still where connectivity has to improve. And then looking at the mobile connectivity, still a lot of work needs to be done, not only in Portugal, everywhere in Europe. And also, let me say that today you have the possibility to hear not only from me, but also from Mrs. Pilar del Castillo, which has been a rapporteur of the telecom package that is today the one that everyone applies in Europe, and then rapporteur of the telecom single market regulation, which is about net neutrality being applied all over Europe, and roaming, end of roaming next year. And again, we should be quite satisfied with what Europe has done, for instance, in the area of net neutrality. We are the only large continent in the world which has a net neutrality law. As you know, in the United States, they tried, but I mean, the only thing that exists is an administrative order from the regulator. And in other parts of the world, they are really looking at Europe. So it was nowhere granted that thanks to the work of the Parliament, the Council, and the Commission, and especially also thanks to the implementing work of BEREC, we now have a stable environment in net neutrality. And in a second, I'll tell you why this is important. And let me also say that today with us there's also Mr. Soriano, which is going to be the next chairman of BEREC, the body of European regulators, that also is in its role of the chairman of the French regulator ARCEP, is a role model in Europe. And also, I mean, he has inspired a lot of the work in the implementation of net neutrality. So it's the best possible chair for BEREC next year, where we will have the challenge of discussing this new gigabit package. Now, let me turn to the gigabit package. So, why is this so important to discuss about gigabit society? It is important because connectivity underpins everything which has to do with the digital transactions. So there's no, of course, electronic banking without the digital connectivity. There's no e-health without digital connectivity. There's no connected car without digital connectivity. So whatever you think about this modern society, without connectivity, the society doesn't work. And gigabit makes the difference. When you have a gigabit connection, you can, for instance, synchronize the servers of a medium enterprise in a couple of hours. With normal connection, it would take you a month. With a gigabit society, you can exchange medical data, such as, for instance, MRI scans or other advanced data about clinical research in seconds. Without the gigabit society, it would take hours. So, and let's imagine driving an automatic car without a gigabit connection. That would be not possible. So our competitiveness as a continent relies on being connected at high speed to the network. So everything which has to do with this industrial revolution, which we are witnessing, starts with good connectivity. And why Europe has to win out, if I can call it, the battle for the next industrial revolution, which is the digital revolution. Because Europe needs to be competitive. Europe has a democratic and social model which is probably the most advanced in the world. Think about our welfare state, and needs value to sustain it, especially in view of a population which is getting older and older. So needs desperately to maintain its competitiveness, and the road to competitiveness is a digital road, is a digital highway. That's why the gigabit package is not just a discussion among experts why and how we are going to get to gigabit society. It's a political priority for everyone in Europe in order to have a competitive economy and a society that functions well. So that's why we presented the package as a package. It's not just the European Communication Code, or in terms of legislation, is the important part of the package. The package is about the communication that basically sets out the policies of the European Union in terms of building this society, the gigabit society. The most important message being in 2025, we really need, every citizen looking at 100 megabit connection, so the basic connection, basically 5 times more than what is the objective for 2020, and at the same time aiming at the possibility for citizens really to have a gigabit opportunity, not only in fixed but also in mobile. And the message is, to do that, we need 500 billion euros investment in Europe. And we are in a competitive world. We compete with others, other parts of the world, in terms of attracting capitals in Europe and investments in Europe. And one of the most important rules for investors is stability of the political system and stability of the regulation. That's why the investments which are needed are very much linked with the regulation considerations. And in Europe, we don't want to abandon the model which is based on competition, because that's the model that has delivered the best results. At the same time, we need to give signals, very clear signals to investors, that this model is open to attract more and more investments, because, as Mrs. Barros has said, there's no competition without investments, because clearly there's no market without competitors. I mean, and to be in the market, you have to invest more and more. So basically, there's no easy solution, but one thing which is clear, the more Europe can give coherent signals, not only from Portugal, not only from France, not only from Spain or Italy, but Europe as a whole, to the investor community, the more the investor community will attract investment. But to do so, at the same time, we will have not to renounce to our core values. That's why, for instance, the new electronic communication code introduces the principle that every citizen has to have the right to access broadband. Very much like, I mean, every citizen has the right to have electricity, water. Then at the European level, so every European will have the right to have broadband connection. That will be the basic right of every European citizen. Not only to have the right to have a broadband connection, but also the right that in case they cannot afford to pay a commercial price, then regulators can intervene in order to mitigate the cost for citizens to access broadband. So for the general population, of course, the way to have competitive broadband prices is through competition and investment. And for special parts of the population, the code introduces the possibility for the regulator to regulate the access price for special categories of citizens that cannot afford it. So that will be a European right, the right of every European to have access to a reasonable quality broadband and to a reasonable price if the European cannot afford it. Another important point that, looking at the citizen perspective, will be that all the rights which today really are part of our way of consuming telecom services, which you are used, transparency, the possibility to compare, will actually remain there, but also when looking at the new services, for instance, services which are offered by companies that today are companies like social media companies, take WhatsApp or other services. Also to those services, some minimum guarantees towards the citizens would apply. Of course, regulation has to be proportionate, regulation has to be, let's say, looking at problems to solve, not inventing problems without a reason. But for instance, when it comes to accessing emergency services, providing the necessary transparency, informing users, everyone that is offering services to citizens should have the same rules. That's the idea. Now, turning to the investments, there's no size fits all in Europe. So I was applauding and commenting favorably what has been done in Portugal to get access to infrastructure. And so in this respect, Portugal has to solve specific problems which are linked to specific areas. So the regulator needs specific tools to do that. Maybe looking at, say, Germany, the situation is completely different. And the German regulator will need different tools. So the idea of the new electronic code is to give more tools to the regulators in order to solve specific problems. And to do that, the regulators will have to dig into what are the issues area by area. That's why the first thing that we want is that when doing a connectivity decision, there should be much more investigation on what is the actual geographic problem in that particular area. But of course, diversity of approach requires also European coordination. And why is it so? It is so because investors, as I said, have to put on the table in Europe 500 billion euros. So they want to be reassured that when taking decisions, there's coherence. And that's why we have proposed to reinforce the European coordination system of regulators, BEREC, in order to deliver even more coherency than in the past. Looking at another problem we want to address and solve with the new European Communication Code is the access to spectrum for citizens, for companies. Why so important? Why is so crucial in the Gigabit Society? I think you experience yourself. When you are in a very dense area, your broadband connection tends to be slower. And imagine when having more and more people connected, I mean, the number of people connected via mobile network is growing and growing, and the number of people downloading and downloading even more is growing exponentially. So if we don't deliver new solution for the spectrum, in certain areas, we can even experience the collapse of the network. We can even experience the fact that people will not be able to use broadband internet. And is it a problem? People do it for fun, to exchange messages, how and when to meet. No, it's not just about this. Broadband connectivity, mobile broadband connectivity, it's about the well-functioning system of the transport system, for instance. The modern transport system, connected vehicles, will be based on mobile connectivity. It's about the health system. I mean, more and more we are having sensors around the body which are connected. More and more doctors will use those sensors to monitor remotely patients, especially chronic patients, with an enormous saving for the health bill of a country. It has been calculated if remote health monitoring works well, there will be a saving of 10 to 20% of the health bill of a country, which in an aging population era, it means 1 or 2% of the GDP of a country of saving. So spectrum is not fun, ladies and gentlemen. Spectrum is a key need for a modern society. That's why we have pushed for a spectrum reform in Europe. We have pushed for the idea that if spectrum needs to be released for mobile services, it has to be released very quickly all over Europe. And that's why we are now pushing that the 700 megahertz spectrum will be released quickly in Europe for 4G services, and that's why we are pushing the new spectrum will be made available for 5G. And we, of course, know that spectrum is also about the sovereignty of governments, which, of course, have the right to decide about the natural resources, very much as they do for other natural resources. But spectrum is also the collective ownership of all Europeans, and that's a European dimension, again, of the problem. That's why we thought that the ideal equilibrium is to say whatever has to do with the economic regulation of spectrum has to be done by independent regulators. They are the best placed to make decisions which are optimized for the, let's say, use of the spectrum for all the services which are needed. When it comes to political decisions about the spectrum, for instance, how much spectrum should be given to the defense or security services, of course, governments will remain the prime actors. But all of this in coordination in Europe with all the other member states. So the whole idea of the code is not to impose a single solution in Europe. The whole idea of the code is to make sure that all the best results that individually member states have achieved now, they can factor it in collectively, and we can work together to deliver better services to the citizens. That's why we hope that this code will be approved quickly, because of course there's no big result to make all this announcement, to prepare all this without a clear win in terms of the timing of approval of all this. But I mean, the initial reactions from all over the places, from, let's say, the telecom community, from the financial community, from the various stakeholders involved in this process are relatively positive. That's why we believe that especially having the Parliament selected a very experienced rapporteur such as Madame del Castillo, we hope that Parliament and Council can progress quickly into the approval of the new electronic code. And again, this I think will be an asset for Europe in the new industrial revolution. So I thank you for the attention and of course ready to answer all the questions you have. Thank you very much.
Creio que temos agora algum tempo para perguntas, portanto, eu vou abrir agora o espaço para que na audiência, quem quiser fazer alguma pergunta, creio que temos alguns microfones disponíveis. Muito bem. Como a primeira pergunta é sempre a mais difícil. So, Roberto, thank you so much for the great presentation you have done, very clear as usual. And maybe I would like to ask you a question that will be probably part of the discussion this afternoon, but we are essentially talking about connectivity. We are talking about investment, lots of investment. And when we think about, well, as you mentioned, in terms of high-speed networks, I think Portugal is doing quite well. But when I look forward and think about 2020, and we think about investment in 5G, my main question or my main concern is where will we find the money and the incentives for operators to make these huge investments for 5G. So probably we will have the opportunity to ask the question to them this afternoon, but I would like to hear from the Commission point of view, what is your idea on what would be the incentives for, in particular, those more peripheral countries that have some economic problems? We will have the conditions for the investment in 5G.
It's a very interesting question. Well, of course, rolling out a 5G infrastructure is not cheap. I mean, and it's not really, I mean, something that operators will do lightly. I think, first of all, it's very clear, and that's the message we are trying to really pass on with this connectivity package, but in general with the digital single market, no country in Europe, even a big one, can do this kind of things alone. I mean, if Europe is divided in this, we'll never get there. Think about something which is connected, but that is not exactly part of the connectivity package. Think about big data and supercomputers, which are basically the factory of the future. I mean, everything is data and data crunching. Europe is nowhere in terms of when you see the top supercomputers of the world, this is all Chinese and Americans. And why? Because we have not invested together. Whilst, for instance, in aerospace, Europe has worked together. I mean, the lesson has been learned throughout the years. In digital, we are still trying to learn this lesson, how to work together. So my first answer is we are, in a way, condemned to work together as Europeans. Probably for most of us, I would say for nearly all of us, it's a pleasure to work together, but in a way, there's no option. In digital, in realizing those objectives, 5G connectivity, big data, supercomputing, the only way is to work together. And that, of course, implies also that in terms of European policies, one has to present instruments to allow Europe to work together, clearly. The second point is from the, let's say, operator's perspective, what the 5G means. Well, one would say it could be a sort of a jump to a next generation connectivity, so it will give operator A and B the sort of competitive edge that today doesn't have. I think this is a possible answer, but it's not so plausible in Europe, where everyone is more or less integrating mobile and fixed and everyone competing on the same, let's say, type of connectivity packages. A much more plausible answer, although this kind of jump ahead kind of answer is the answer in some parts of the world, but this is not the answer for Europe. Probably the answer for Europe, why companies will invest in 5G, it's because of what we call in our jargon the verticals, which is working with specific industries, in particular the car industry, the health industry, the media industry. When you look at these three particular verticals, which we have selected as the sort of the head start for 5G, it's clear that both industries, they have to gain a lot to work together. And it's not for chance that very recently the mobile industry and the car industry have announced an alliance on 5G to start an experimentation. Because they all have to gain in working together. The car industry needs the connectivity, advanced connectivity that 5G can deliver, and the telecom industry needs the car industry to invest in connectivity in order to sustain the investment. Another very large industry, it's 9% of our GDP, it's the health industry. The health industry is transforming in an impressive way and needs connectivity to transform. So again, by having, let's say, this alliance between the health industry, which is really an important industry, it's important for all of us as a service, but it's also important for Europe as an industry. Europe is in the lead in health services. Then again, from this marriage, you can see, I mean, how the investments could flow. And the third one, the obvious one, which for instance is the primary target for the Koreans for this advanced presentation of the 5G, is the media industry. Think about augmented reality, the Pokemon reality, for you that, I mean, play with Pokemon. But I mean, augmented reality is something very serious, by the way. Think about people working on complex machines, people doing repairs, people doing complex tasks. With augmented reality, their productivity and the safety of what they do will augment a lot. For instance, we are sponsoring research activities about psychology and augmented reality, how people can be helped in certain situations with augmented reality. So apart from the Pokemon dimension of augmented reality is really the future when you're looking at the internet. I mean, and the way internet will be available. Think about connected objects and the way, I mean, you can actually scan an environment and get information from. So this is not science fiction. It's already happening. It's happening for fun with this Pokemon exercise, and will happen more and more. So again, the link between media, augmented reality, the new generation internet, and 5G will be a winning one. So my answer is basically, in Europe, this is the winning model. The telecom industry being a bit more horizontal on the infrastructure layer, working together with these verticals, especially car, health, and media.
Thank you, Roberto. But just, I would like to add, you mentioned to work together at European level. But would it be possible, or would it make sense that in a given country, let's say about Portugal, that 5G could be the result of also an alliance or a kind of co-investment among operators? Let me explain. We don't have car industry, unfortunately. So I think there is, we can have a kind of digital divide in Europe in terms of the countries that have industry and will benefit from this type of development, and the countries that don't have. But what I could see is the possibility of joint efforts among operators in order to do this type of investment. Would it make sense? We are sharing the mic.
Yes, sharing economy. No, I think it makes a lot of sense. And I mean, again, Europe would be a mistake if in Europe we think 28 has to do the same thing. 28 car industry, 28 health industry, 28 touristic economies. Every area, every region has its specialty, but every region in some way can benefit from the digital revolution. Now, what you mentioned, let me advertise again the code, is one of the possibilities which are relatively new in the code. Now, what is the problem? When you experience it with your phone, sometimes you have perfect connectivity, sometimes your connectivity drops. But then you discover other operators are covering the area. Now, this is perfectly okay, it's called competition. But in some areas, some operators will never go there. So it makes a lot of sense, especially at the basic level of infrastructure, if they would share part of the investment. And this is not in contradiction with the competition law. That's why the code has a number of new instruments exactly going in this direction at the disposal of the regulator in order to have universal connectivity. And think what universal connectivity and high-quality 5G connectivity can do for Portugal in terms of the strengths of Portugal in terms of industries and services, and how this can be enhanced with the universal high-speed connectivity. That's why part of the package is this Wi-Fi for EU, which it's a small thing, but it's an important token to connectivity everywhere. Because that now it's being understood, and I'm very glad that Portugal was ahead with this Wi-Fi initiative in Portugal. I've been in Sintra and I've seen the signpost, Sintra Wi-Fi, in Cascais, the same, free Wi-Fi. Because that's important, because people being connected to Wi-Fi, they consume more services. So again, there's really a very strict correlation nowadays between connectivity and the possibility to have services, activities which are offered to people. And the more you do that, the more you have an inclusive society and a society that is more prone to, let's say, consume what is on offer.
Thank you, Roberto. I think we have another question over there. They are competing for the question.
Okay, this is a question about spectrum management. You said spectrum is not fun. I actually think it's fun. And one dimension in which I think it is fun regards coordination, because I still do not understand fully what the European Commission thinks about the meaning of coordination, because the coordination has different dimensions, and my personal opinion is that in some dimensions it makes a lot of sense to have a more coordinated move. If you are talking about license duration, for instance, or awarding the spectrum in the same moment in time, so that you can allow like big players, pan-European players to have a broader strategy across Europe, it makes sense. Where I think coordination does not make a lot of sense regards the design of the awarding procedure. This is a completely different story, because the competition dynamics within each country is different. And so I also think that this peer reviewing process that the Commission is trying to incentivize might actually create some inertia in the process. It might make us waste time, and it's true that we need pan-European players, but we also need some small players to compete with big players. And in my perspective, at least, I think that coordination at the awarding procedure that does not make a lot of sense, and I would like to hear your opinion on that, if possible. Thank you.
Thank you. No, one thing I agree, one thing I disagree. And one thing I agree, spectrum is fun. I mean, I always enjoyed, doing spectrum design and auction design. And I must say, on the second part, I a little bit disagree, having looked at the horror stories, also from my perspective as former chairman of the Radio Spectrum Policy Group in Europe, real horror stories. I mean, you cannot justify to an investor why in a certain country you have a reverse auction, in another country a single sealed envelope with just one price, in another country an ascending auction for the same spectrum. And why in a country, I mean, you have an auction and then you impose asymmetric conditions which are different from another country. And why in a country you have 15 years license and in another country you have an indefinite license. I think this really, and that we have listened over and over, I mean, you as those of you that work in the telecom and regulatory community meet with investors regularly, and they complain about this. They complain about the level of uncertainty that is in spectrum regulation. Now, have we proposed the single European regulator on spectrum? No. I mean, that would be a mistake. That I agree with you. Have we proposed a sort of veto right by a European body or by the Commission on spectrum? No. And that, again, would be not palatable. We have proposed a very quick system, 30 days of consultation among independent regulators, which has been the key success story of European regulation in market analysis. Now, everywhere in the world, the European system is regarded probably to be the best one. And this is based on independent regulators working together and commenting on each other's work. I think it's a very civilized way of looking at things without imposing something on a regulator that will be taking the ultimate decision, but we listen to his peers. And by the way, listening for 30 days is much better than creating damages for a year, 2 years, or 3 years. We have a case in Europe where a 4G auction lasted 1.5 years, the auction. And then still we are with legal uncertainties because we have some doubts, and market players also have doubts. Then there's, I mean, appeal on the procedure and all the rest. So why not losing few weeks in discussing together if you can spare years of litigation afterwards?
There is another question.
In the history of the European Union, there has always been a tension between increasing harmonization that usually is related to increasing efficiency and the respect of national preferences and the respect of national differences. I wonder if the code or the proposal for the next code for electronic communications does not introduce us in the next level, meaning that we do not have there a trade-off between increasing harmonization plus increasing efficiency versus national differences, but we have a trade-off between increasing harmonization and efficiency. And this is related, part of it with the point raised by my colleague, but also it is related with the powers that will be given to the Commission in phase 2 Article 7 procedures. Because in this case we are taking really the risk of having a more uniform regulation at the EU level with efficiency costs at national and regional levels. And I wonder if this is your view. Of course it's not, because another way the proposal probably would be different. But what are the risks that you are considering in this area? The second question is related to the role of BEREC. I think it's fair to say that BEREC does not represent and has not been representing in the last years at least the full diversity and richness of regulatory experience at the European Union level. But on the other hand, BEREC is not a European regulatory agency, because European regulatory agencies are focused on giving sound technical and scientific advice to the Commission, and that's not the case of BEREC. It's not the case of BEREC now, and it does not seem to be the case of BEREC in the future. I'm sorry to say that, but BEREC seems to have been acting basically as a follower of some Commission policies, of some Commission trends. I wonder if it would not be more fruitful from the point of view of the future to let BEREC evolve to a full European regulatory agency with the responsibility of giving the European Commission technical and scientific advice instead of insisting on something that does not seem to be real. That BEREC really shows the diversity and the richness of national regulatory experiences, because it seems to me that the evidence of the last few years do not support this idea. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll try to give an answer which is not just directed to the regulators in the room, otherwise becomes a sort of closed circle discussion, but tries to capture what you are saying in a more, let's say, wider perspective. On this issue, regulation versus harmonization, the powers of the Commission. I mean, the Commission is by treaty the guardian of European rules and doesn't need power by secondary or primary legislation. So if we need to intervene because we believe a regulator or a company is violating the European law, we have all the possibilities to do that. And we don't need to invent a system to do that. We need to invent a system when we want to delegate our powers. That's the point. And that was done in the package. The first decision was done some 15 years ago, when basically the power to do certain things was shifted to independent regulators. And that has been constantly the idea going forward, that more and more we will shift powers which normally we would handle at the central level to independent bodies. This is not just in telecom, by the way, in energy, in privacy, in finance. So that has been a constant decision of the Commission to decentralize the compliance with the European law. So the proposal of the European Code is quite new in this respect. It's what we call the double lock system, which means no one holds the key to decide what is right, what is wrong, for instance, when it comes to regulatory measures. But this key will be shared between regulators and the Commission. And only if regulators and the Commission agree, then we can turn the key and say to a particular national decision, you please present it again. Again, it's not the end of the world. I mean, the Commission has much more weapons. I mean, if something is against the European law, can bring someone to court. Here is basically the system that is in the electronic code is to say, if regulators and the Commission agree that something is not really in line, then the regulator that has presented, the country that has presented this proposal should think twice before adopting it and representing this. So it is not about new powers of the Commission, because again, the Commission does not need a particular regulation to confer powers to the way it acts. It's exactly a little bit the contrary. Now, on the shape, I think BEREC has been an extremely successful, I wouldn't call it anymore experiment. It was an experiment when we started quite some time ago. Now it's a reality. It's a reality that has been given very recently, as I was saying before, very delicate tasks, such as, for instance, the guidelines of issuing guidelines to adopt about net neutrality. Very delicate task on roaming, very delicate task in the new code on deciding what is the termination rate, so the fee that everyone will pay when terminating a network. That will be done at European level, and there will be basically a BEREC decision. So those kind of tasks require, of course, also responsibility. That's why BEREC needs a legal personality. Now, basically, in the history of independent bodies in Europe, there have been two waves. One wave, which was the wave of the late 90s, mid of beginning of 2000, which was private organization, private bodies can do things. You don't really need European settings. And that was the thinking before the collapse that we have seen in financial markets. Then a second wave of regulators emerged in Europe, which are the European banking authorities, other regulators which have a new structure, new powers, because it has been recognized that independent regulation is very important for the functioning of the European economy. So BEREC belongs to its sort of second generation bodies, that's our ambition. At the same time, we didn't want to change much of the BEREC structure. For instance, BEREC doesn't have a professional chair because it's best served by the rotating system, whilst the European Banking Authority has a professional chair. So we try to maintain the structure of the existing BEREC, but at the same time reflect the fact that BEREC will grow enormously in terms of importance. Now, to do that, of course, we have also to align with what we sign as an agreement with Parliament and Council, because at a certain point, the Parliament and Council told the Commission, you cannot every time create a body and give a new life to this body. Let's try to harmonize the minimum functioning. So we had to be loyal to what we have signed, the three institutions, but the three institutions can change. And that was the case, for instance, of the so-called Article 29, which is the system of the privacy regulators in Europe, which has legal personality, but very peculiar functioning. So this is matter now for Council and Parliament to find, let's say, the right balance in this. But there's one point which cannot be forgotten in all this discussion. There's no responsibility without, of course, accountability. So whatever design we think about the future of BEREC, these two elements, accountability and responsibility, should go together.
Thank you, Roberto. Any other question? We have a question over there.
I have two questions, one for Mrs. Fatima Barros and the other one to Mr. Roberto Viola. The first question concerns the words of Mrs. Fatima Barros in this speech and the words of the Minister. I think that the program for the Gigabit Society is a European program. And this means that we are losing independence because the program is approved by the Union and Portugal has a small presence in the Union. This happened already in other fields, like in the financial service, in transport, and so on. This means that the government and ANACOM agrees with the loss of independence concerning the regulation powers. The other question concerning Mr. Roberto Viola. I don't believe that 500 billion invested by public funds will increase the competitiveness of Europe. We had already in the past invested hundreds of billions in telecommunications, and the European crisis doesn't have anything with the digital society. Has relations with other questions that the Gigabit Society doesn't solve. I think that the investment should be done not by public funds, but by private funds, like in the US, like in other parts of the world, because private investors, they have a clear view about the market opportunities. And the bureaucracy of Brussels doesn't have the same view. The other point concerns Portugal. If the Union goes to invest 500 billion in the Gigabit Society, this means that Portugal should contribute for the program with 5 billion around. But we are receiving only 1.5 or less of funds from Union Europe. What's your position, Mr. Roberto Viola?
Oh, thank you. Okay. If I understood well, you think that we should be concerned about the proposal of the Commission because we are losing independence. Is it okay? Well, not really. I don't feel that reading all the proposals, of course, this is a very dense document, but so far, I don't think that we are losing independence. Somehow, we believe that we are having more flexibility in terms of regulatory decisions. And I think in these terms, the Commission is giving a different vision on the type of regulation that can be implemented in different markets. The only discussion we could have could be on this question of the veto power in remedies, but I don't think this is the main issue. So far, the most important for regulators is that we have flexibility to use different tools to apply to our national markets.
For what concerns my part of the answer, if I was not clear, I apologize, but I said that the 500 billion should come from the private sector. That's why we need a stable regulatory environment, because I agree with you. I mean, private investors have many opportunities and possibilities, and will only invest if the market conditions are the right one, and at the same time, if the regulatory environment is the right one. Now, concerning what is in for Portugal, I would say, of course, every opinion has to be respected. As a matter of fact, Portugal still receives more from the union budget than it pays. So if you want to do this kind of calculation, but will not be the right one in any case. I mean, Germany pays more in than what receives directly from the budget. But of course, here the game is what the single market means and what the digital single market means for all of Europe. What kind of opportunities are for the Portuguese young people if the digital single market works in Europe, and what kind of opportunities will be missed? That's the real point. I said, and I believe there's no single European, no Italian, no Spanish, no Portuguese, no German, that will win this battle alone. This is too big for even the big countries of Europe. This is about the change of our society. So the only way that we succeed in delivering the change of the society, the skills which are needed, I completely agree with what the minister said. One important part of the agenda is about skilling and having, especially young people with the right skills. Delivering the high technology in big data, supercomputing, delivering the infrastructure, the Gigabit Society. There's no possibility that a single state will win this battle.
Thank you. It's time now to close the session. I'd like once again to thank you, Roberto Viola, for being with us today. He's very busy for the moment, but this time he had the time to come to Portugal. Thank you so much.